Here's my goal today. My goal is to help us reflect a little bit about what we went through the last 2 years and sort of chart a course ahead. And that's actually what I've been doing a lot of time, spending a lot of time doing. I've been thinking deeply about what just happened and how did it happen and what in the world was going on. I've been in medical practice for 36 years. So you could say I've been aware of the backstory in medicine for many, many years. But I was surprised to see how fast everything changed in terms of world lockdown. So I'm going to just jump into this. I'll just briefly say, first of all, thank you to my wife, Virginia, for being here. I'm honored to have Brian Hooker here. Thank you to my son, Joshua. This is the first time I'm using PowerPoint, okay? So I'm sort of I usually just shoot from the hip, which has its advantages, but disadvantages as well. This time, I'll at least sort of remember what I said, and I'll be able to present it again if the opportunity arises. I also want to thank my great mentor. I can never get through this. Dr. Mayer Eisenstein, who really inspired me, and I wouldn't be here if he hadn't taught me so many things. But really, he taught me a lot of this kind of analysis. So I'm going to try to go through this quickly. It's a very sort of brief overview. I'm trying to get a big picture, which I really haven't heard from other resources. So I'm hoping you'll hear something new here today that maybe you hadn't thought about. I'm trying to really connect some dots so we can really move ahead, and whenever this happens again, we'll be ready. Some of the slides are going to be very brief. There's some of the slides where I could do a whole lecture just on that slide. So I apologize if it seems like we're moving through some subjects quickly, but I want to really preserve that big picture idea. So without further ado, finding the road less traveled, overcoming the scientific dictatorship. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I would say amen to that for me. Yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on. Eric agrees with that. For the rock music aficionados I'm trying to appeal to everybody, okay? trying to get a broad audience here.
You just lost me.
Oh, no. Well, maybe this will win you back. I've got C.S. Lewis here. I love this quote. We all want progress, but progress means getting nearer to the place where you want to be. And if you've taken a wrong turning, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man. That is a deep mind. I admire him. I wish I could be more like him. So I'm going to sort of start off with some what I call questionable questions, because I think sometimes we're asking the wrong question. But the questions are, does science make faith obsolete? We hear that so often. Is there a war between science and religion? I think by the end of this talk, we'll have some answers. So I'm going to start off with this big concept of a worldview. You've probably heard of this before, but a worldview is simply your orientation, the way you look at the world. And it usually starts with a beginning point. And here's a very important point. The beginning point is always a step of faith. There is no absolute starting point that, oh, this is the right starting point. Your starting point depends on what you choose. And that is, there's no scientific theory that will tell you what to choose. So it's faith-based starting point. Then you travel your road, that's applications, and you reach an end point. So I'm going to look at two worldviews, which I think are the two predominant worldviews we're talking about. First is theism, which is a God-based worldview. I'm going to primarily look at Judeo-Christian aspect of that. And the next worldview is naturalistic materialism, atheism. Naturalism and materialism are sort of an interchangeable word. but it means you just look at what you can see, what's created. We don't acknowledge any supernatural realities. So this is what I sort of just said. We're starting with a transcendent personal God who created the material universe. In theism, in naturalism, we're starting with matter is eternal, and the matter creates everything, including man. Now, as I mentioned, both of these roads start with faith. And when you start with faith, from there you use reason and logic to proceed and see where we go. So we're going to actually take a journey along each of those two roads and see what it looks like. So the first road is theism. How does it start? God creates matter, then life, then man in his own image. The Bible reveals creation, fall, redemption. And that explains goodness, evil, and hope. God created everything good. We had the fall. We have evil entering into the world. And in my belief world, Jesus Christ is our redemption who takes us on a path of restoring. It's a way out of the evil that we see around us. And the verse for that is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Genesis 1. Let's look at the other worldview. Materialism. Eternal matter develops into life, which develops into a man who imagines God and ends in nothingness. Richard Dawkins has a good explanation for that. I like Richard Dawkins because he is a materialist. He's a very honest materialist. He speaks the truth of this viewpoint. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And so I'm just going to note on that. You'll notice there is no basis for morality because there is no good, there's no evil. Remember the first view, there was good, there was evil. In this view, there is no basis for saying anything is good or anything is evil. There's also no basis for free will because matter is just molecules in motion. And if you are a determined being that's just molecules in motion, that means everything that happens is just a matter of what your molecules are doing. And your molecules just proceed from one act to the next. And there's no real basis to explain free will, like how do I make a decision? So if you hear these gentlemen that are following this worldview quoted long enough, they will tell you very often that, yeah, we're just machines. We're just programmed and we're moving forward and we can't really change our direction. So let's look at some applications here. I just wanted to mention that we're going to start back in 1543. Originally, I was going to start back in 1859, but I decided that wasn't far back enough. So we're going back to 1543 with what we call the beginning of the scientific revolution. Does anybody know what happened in 1543? Any takers on that one? Copernicus came forward with his theory that the sun was actually the center of the universe, which went against the current science of the time. People think, oh, it was a big religious fight. No, it was the science. Ptolemy had the original sort of model that everybody's using, and Copernicus shifted it to the sun. He was very cautious about that. He knew he was going to take some heat for it, so he actually published it the year he died, and then didn't have to really defend it. But it turns out it took off. And I want you to look at the bottom list. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Boyle, Faraday, Clerk-Maxwell, Cuvier, Linnaeus, Agassiz, Kelvin, and I would say countless others were all Christians. So what I want you to notice is science was birthed out of a Christian worldview. And how did that happen? It's because they saw that there was a lawgiver. So they said, well, if there's a lawgiver and there's one God and he's rational and he's given us rational minds and he created a universe, we should be able to find laws in this universe that explain what's going on. So the first time, across all the different cultures that men and women used math to describe what's happening. They said there's laws and we can figure out these laws. F equals ma. Force equals mass times acceleration. They said never been done before. So it flowed out of the concept that there was a monotheistic God, and other cultures that didn't have this concept didn't look for these things. So I'm going to divide science. I think I'm doing this right. Yeah. I'm going to divide science into 3 areas. We have physics, chemistry, and biology. It's useful to divide this up because we'll understand better what happened in history if you look at things as separate entities. Physics, as you know, is physical motion. Chemistry is chemical interactions. Biology is the study of life forms. So what happened was the Age of Enlightenment. So all those gentlemen that were just on that last slide, when they made their amazing discoveries, didn't say, oh my goodness, I guess we don't need God anymore. No, they said exactly the opposite. They said, wow, this is an amazing God. I can't believe the marvelous nature of his creation that we can even describe it with mathematical equations. But as time went on, 1600 to 1700, there is a philosophical movement we call the Age of Enlightenment, which exalted human reason. And the thinkers and philosophers of the time started to take a different viewpoint. They said, wow, we've got equations. Maybe we don't need God. And so the world began to shift in this direction. So they sort of kicked God out of physics and chemistry because they said, hey, we've got the equations. I think that's just the nature of the universe, and we were smart enough to figure it out. And there's really nothing behind that. They became materialists in a sense. But biology remained a mystery. Nobody had a law to explain what we saw in the world of biology. When you think of it, physics and chemistry, you can roll a ball and it just moves. But nobody can predict where I'm going to move next, can they? Try to make an equation for my movements. You're going to have difficulty. So we needed, the Enlightenment thinkers needed a mechanism to describe biology. So Charles Darwin provided them with such a mechanism in 1859, his book, The Origin of the Species. So there were 2 important pieces to this. First of all, he made biology autonomous. He said, hey, I just figured out how life formed. Guess, it starts from an amoeba, it goes to man. I've got a law that describes this. We don't need God. So that took care of biology, but it did more than that. It actually put all of science. Remember, we had physics and chemistry with laws that explained everything. Now we had biology with a law, and guess what? We now separated God completely from science. That was a radical change that happened. Because prior to that, people always looked at the world through the vision of having a God who created things. So I'm just going to say this really, try to summarize it briefly. So what was the mechanism that Darwin proposed? It's called natural selection. He looked at pigeon breeders, and pigeon breeders could make all these different breeds, long tufts, funny tails, and he saw that there was heredity that could be moved in different directions. And so he extrapolated, based on some of the findings in the fossil record, that, okay, we're seeing those small changes. I think if those small changes kept happening, we would get from amoeba to man. We could actually see that. Given 4 billion years, who knows what could happen? The thing he didn't mention was that when you release the pigeons and allow them to interbreed again, all the fancy pigeons revert back to the single plain pigeon. So they always seemed like there was a point, you could get variation, but you could only go so far, and there was a boundary, and then you couldn't go further. But he said, well, I'm looking at the fossils, I think it happens. So he extrapolated and said, I'm looking at microevolution, but I'm going to say, I think there's macroevolution, which means we're actually shifting from one species type to another, not just staying within the confines of one particular type. And this was a speculation. I would just, before I delve in a little bit to that, I would just like to mention, I'll tell you a personal story. When I studied this in high school, I was raised in a Christian home, but I thought, you know what, this is all making so much sense. I think maybe I should be an atheist, because there were so many things that fell. Yeah, I know that would have been a mistake, wouldn't it? Fortunately, God kept me on the right path. But one thing I wish somebody had come aside when I was in high school and told me there were big questions that weren't being answered by the theory of evolution. The first was, how do we get something from nothing? Like, how did this all get started in the first place? The next one is, how do we get life from non-life? Darwin's theory only takes you from amoeba to man, but doesn't tell you how the amoeba got there. So even, I'm not saying it's the case, but even if Darwin was right, he still has a big gaping hole to say, how do we get these random molecules jumping around to a self-replicating, highly functional cell? Now, the way he sort of jumped over that equation or that idea was, he thought cells were just little, you look at them under the microscope, they were just little blibs, like, oh, those are like little pieces of jelly moving around. They're very simple, and then life gets increasingly complex as it evolves. And then another big unanswered question, how do we get consciousness from non-consciousness? It's very weird, but chimpanzees are 98.5% genetically identical to us. So there must be something more than genes differentiating us, because I feel like everybody's pretty much different from a chimpanzee. You have consciousness, you have language. These are unexplainable things that we can't really say, how did that happen? So I just want to give you a quick look at what we now know about the complexity of the cell.
Here, the two strands of DNA are being unwound and separated by the tiny blue molecular machine called helicase. Helicase literally spins as fast as a jet engine. The strand of DNA on the right has its complementary strand assembled continuously, but the other strand is more complicated because it runs in the opposite direction. So it must be looped out with its complementary strand assembled in reverse, section by section. At the end of this process, you have two identical DNA molecules.
But this is a problem with Darwin's theory, because Darwin assumed the cell was simple. We see we can go from me all the way down to a cell and really not lose any complexity. That is like a factory in there. And all that was happening there was the DNA separating and replicating, like when a cell is going to divide. That's what we were watching. It looks like a highly structured and designed assembly line. But you know the amazing thing about that assembly line that we don't have in any of our assembly lines? What do you think is the biggest difference? That assembly line replicates itself. What would it be like if we had assembly lines that replicated themselves? Now that would be a feat of engineering. So already Darwin's theory is on a shaky ground. Like, the more we know, I would propose that if Darwin proposed his theory today, it would not pass muster. The only reason it's with us is because the seductive idea of being cut off and not having to deal with God is a very seductive idea. Here's another problem with Darwin's theory. It's called the Cambrian explosion. So what Darwin proposed was, well, you start with a cell, and then it at some point it becomes multicellular, and then one kind of cell becomes a mollusk, and another becomes a worm, and another becomes a fish, and you have this gradual accumulation of structure. But there's something called the Cambrian explosion, which took place, I believe, 540 million years ago, where it's bizarre, but all the phyla appear at once. 25 phyla. Instead of having gradual development and each phyla then starts to make its appearance, everything happens at once. Well, that goes against Darwin's theory. Looks a bit like a creation event. There's Darwin's prediction that we have a gradual increase in the number of phyla. A phyla is like, different classes, like mammals, reptiles, amphibians, And he said these are just going to gradually accumulate like this. But what happened? This. They all come up all at once. Now, how did that happen? Here's another picture of what it should look like. We should see a tree. And he actually this was the only diagram in The Origin of Species, was a diagram like this that showed this branching as more and more species evolve into different types. But this is what we actually see. The little dotted lines that are moving upward are hypothetical connecting missing links that should be there, and they're not. So all we see is straight lines of all these phyla going up. Now, there is something that happens. There is something we call microevolution. That means, that's like bacterial resistance and things like that. We see that. That's undeniable. It's in the lab. But what we don't see is amoeba to man. That's a hypothesis that isn't looking so good. Obviously, he also, one of the mechanisms that Darwin proposed, actually it's neo-Darwinism, because we didn't know about genes when Darwin made his theory. Now we know about genes. So the hypothesis is, the gene mutations. You have a mutation, and then one species is more survivable, so they live. But think of it this way. A gene mutation is like taking the works of Shakespeare and starting to change letters. Do we get more information or less information doing that? No, we degrade information. And it's well shown in these experiments they've done with fruit flies. They never get a real healthier fruit fly. They get weird stuff. This is fruit flies that have been subjected to radiation. It affects their wings, their eyes, their leg structure, their antennae, but never moves them in a good direction. So it appears that mutations, rather than being helpful, are actually harmful. They actually take us in the wrong direction. Here's another example. Darwin heavily relied on the idea that within the embryo development, you could see evolution happening before your eyes. We started out, let's go back to when I'm 2 cells. And as I get bigger and bigger, I go through sort of a fish stage, and then I go through an amphibian stage, and then go through a reptile stage, and then go through a mammal stage, and finally I'm a recognizable human being. So he's comparing embryos. If you go from the top down, you've got a fish embryo, a salamander embryo, a turtle embryo, a bird embryo, a pig embryo, a sheep embryo, I'm not sure what that one is, and finally a human embryo. And Ernest Haeckel, under his microscope, drew these embryos and said, see, they're all following the same pattern. Well, guess what? They discovered it was a fraud. He had actually cherry-picked his embryos. They don't really follow the same paths, and they don't really look like each other. He had actually drawn them in a false way, and it's been clearly recognized and documented that this was a fraud. And there's one of the key arguments that Darwin used to support his theory. Then there's another problem, transitional forms. You'll hear evolutionists say, well, we figured out how we got from reptiles to mammals, and they show you the skull sequence. It all has to do with the way the jaw bones are changing and becoming ear bones. And this is the transitional series that they usually portray. But if we actually look at the true series in its actuality, that's what it looks like. If we draw it to scale, it's not very convincing, I would say. And we still haven't explained, when you think of going reptiles to mammals, you have to go from a 3-chamber heart to 4-chamber heart, cold-blooded to warm-blooded, egg-laying to placental. How does that happen? We don't really have an explanation. So that was problems with Darwin's theories. Now we're going to go to application problems. Here's one application. Remember Ernest Haeckel, the fraudulent embryology guy? Well, he came up with a proposed plan for how man had evolved. And he said, I even see it in the races, you know? And so we're starting down at lower right, a mandrill, and we're going this way. And we just get more and more advanced. And you can see the white European is the pinnacle of evolution, and everybody else is lower on the evolutionary path. And that sounds crazy to us today, doesn't it? But realize this was taken very seriously. And you know why it was taken seriously? Because it was science. And you don't argue with science. And Ernest Haeckel was a German. And you can guess who might have used some of his ideas in their ideology. Here's something that happened in the United States. Has anybody heard of human zoos before? Out of curiosity? Yeah. So this is a fellow named Ota Benga. He was 21 years old. He was exhibited in the Brooklyn Zoo in 1904 in a cage with a chimpanzee. And as an example of evolution, here's the chimp, here's the next stage, and you guys on the outside looking in, you're the pinnacle of evolution right now. And thousands of people came. There were ministers that objected to this. They said, this guy's a human being. He's made in the image of God. This is preposterous. But the owner of the Bronx Zoo said, hey, we're making too much money. We're not listening to you. He was later released and committed suicide 10 years after his release. And it says in the little article there, the fine print, it says, some laugh over his antics, but many are not pleased. Keeper frees him at times. They would let him loose around the zoo, and the crowds would sort of like follow him. It's just, when you read the description, it's shocking. I think it's one of the references I have in the back. It's called Human Zoos. Okay, we better move. Let's move. The other bad thing was, so now we've got eugenics. You know, that's a foreign word to us, but in the early 1900s, 20s, and 30s particularly, we had eugenic societies. Again, this was science. We were going to make a perfect race. We were going to make sure the right people got married and the wrong people maybe got sterilized. This was developed by one of Darwin's cousins, Francis Galton, and Adolf Hitler borrowed from our eugenics program. Obviously, people will say, well, I never would have taken it where he took it. But according to the rule of naturalism, remember, there is no good and there is no evil. So you can pretty much do whatever you want to do. So invariably, these show class prejudice and racism, because it's always certain races that aren't so acceptable. I'm just going to give you a clip here.
A lot of scientists carry with them this myth of the gene, almost to its furthest extent. That there is a thing called the gene, and once we understand that, we're going to be able to manipulate it and modify it to explain why people are unequal and to make some people better.
So according to this worldview, that's where you have to go. Because if you want to change society, you've got to change the genes. That's where their worldview inevitably leads them.
The lower 10% who really have difficulty, even in elementary school. What's the cause of it? A lot of people like to say, well, it was, poverty and things like that, but it probably isn't. And so I'd like to get rid of, help that lower 10%.
Suppose we have a gene therapy which will raise IQs by 15 points. I think parents, it's okay if they have the right to introduce those kinds of changes in their own children.
Molecular genetics has been an area full of promises. We were told that this is going to allow us to design babies any way we want them, to decide whether we want smart kids, tall kids, short kids, what have you. We now know that it's built on false promises because the theory that gave rise to it is wrong.
Scientists have actually shown that genetic excuses for inequality are unscientific. But the story hasn't been told very often. It puts the very notion of a gene into question and reveals that the concept itself may never have been more than a figment of our collective imagination.
The gene was never discovered. It was not a discovery that somebody did, look down a microscope and said, ha, behold the gene. Instead of that, the gene was a concept. And so we can see throughout the 20th century how different discoveries in science were fitted into the box, the pre-made conceptual box of the gene.
So what happened was Hitler messed them up because he went so far. It's sort of like what we just saw with COVID. It went so far that it got everybody's attention. Well, Hitler went so far that all of a sudden eugenics became a bad word. And we changed our eugenic societies to genetics societies. So you won't hear the word eugenics anymore. You will hear the word genetics. You'll hear James Watson giving you some of his thoughts in this clip.
James Watson also regrets that eugenics has been tainted by the Nazi legacy. He says it's our responsibility to prevent the birth of those he deems unfit, as long as families themselves make the decisions. Watson believes in the unlimited use of genetic engineering to enhance future generations, and isn't worried such eugenic measures would be taken to the extreme.
Hitler's got us twice. We're hostage to what Hitler did, and that things which we might say are sensible, we can't do because people say, well, Hitler would have done exactly the same thing.
Scary dude. I'll just say that. But how consistent is that with what we heard Richard Dawkins say? There is no purpose, there is no evil, there is no good. This is the path. Does this path sound like maybe the path we were just on? So I'm going to just mention here briefly, how does Darwin survive? We've already seen it sort of falls apart at the seams. Nothing that Darwin predicted really came to fruition. And then we see when it's applied, oh my goodness, this is criminal. And how can we even think this? It's because of the seductive idea that Darwin sort of, he was the capstone for it, that now we don't have to acknowledge God. There's no rules. Science can go wherever it wants to go. Science wants that kind of power. It wants to go wherever it wants to go. It doesn't want any rules to hold it back. And that is such a seductive idea that science has now become equated with naturalism. When we think of science, we don't think of any mention of God. Oh no, that's science. We're not talking about God here. But when we put God out, we can see what happens. So here's another quote from Dawkins. Even if there was no actual evidence in favor of the Darwinian theory, we should still be justified in preferring it over all rival theories. And another university professor, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. That is a telling quote. That means science is starting with an ideology. It starts with the ideology that there is no God. and goes from there. It starts on the materialistic, atheistic path, and they don't want to get off that path. It doesn't matter if you show them things that, we're not willing to get off this path. So now I'm going to just briefly say, we live, first of all, I should have started my talk with this. I think we live at the most exciting time the world has ever seen. This is an amazing time. Things are happening. It was horrible, wasn't it? But it had to be horrible for us to wake up. And so I don't want you to be despondent about the times we live in. I want you to be thrilled, excited. It's like the enemy, I'm just going to say it that way, the enemy has sort of overplayed his hand and revealed himself to a great degree. But I'm also going to say we live in a time when there's more evidence for the existence of God than at any other time on the face of the planet. I'm going to show you 3 things that compellingly point to the existence of God. First, the Big Bang. The universe has a beginning. Did you know when that became a prominent scientific viewpoint? Do you know the year? What would you guess? When did we figure out that the universe had a beginning? Eric's got it, 1960s. Arnzo Penzias, they found the cosmic background radiation that confirmed what Hubble had seen in his telescope, that all the galaxies, when you look at them, are in fact going like this. Extrapolate backwards, that means there's a point in time, they call it a singularity, where there is no time and there's no space. It's created. There's some arguments against that, but they sound a little crazy. Like, oh, there's a quantum vacuum and there's a flux in the quantum vacuum. And then this happened. Everything we see just self-assembled. I haven't, but I'm going to have to go on. We'll get into questions. So the question is, what is the first cause? Theists say there is an eternal, self-existent God that set everything into beginning. Exhibit 2, the fine-tuning of the universe. All of our physical constants, gravity, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, the ratio of the mass of the proton to the neutron, the electromagnetic force, all of these have precise values that if they varied by even 1/10⁻⁶, everything falls apart. So and you could say there's hundreds of dials. They call it the Goldilocks universe. We live in the universe that's just right for life. The only argument to have about that has been, well, there must be like a universe generating machine, and there's probably 1 million universes that we can't really see, but that means none of them worked, but ours did, because we are 1 in 1 million, but there really is 1 million out there. That's the kind of arguments that are being used. So doesn't this imply a designer? And finally, this is the capstone. And James Watson and Francis Crick, if they had any idea what their discovery would have implied, I think they would have buried the evidence, because this is the most compelling information that there is a God outside of us. Information in the cell. You wouldn't think like, so what? There's information in the cell. If you see a book, that's information. What's the first thing you say? Who's the author? Whenever you see information, there's a computer program. Well, there's a mind behind the computer program. When you ever see information, that is the calling card of a mind. We never have information that self-assembles. I know they talk about 100 monkeys, 1 billion years typing out Shakespeare. Doesn't really happen. They've run the statistics. You'd need a gazillion, trillion, bagillion years to even, all that just to say, we can extrapolate from what we know about information. When we see information, there's a mind. And each cell in our bodies has an imprint that there's a mind that has designed us. So it appears more and more that we aren't looking at just mass or matter and energy. There's a third component that we have to take into mind, and that's intelligence. Our intelligence is an ethereal entity. it's not just my brain neurotransmitters bouncing around in my brain. There's something weird about intelligence, and you can't describe it by working it down into molecules. Just like you can't make a computer figure out how a computer is working by taking it down to the parts of all its little circuits and that. You know, it's the collective together. And even computers can't do what our minds do, which is make a decision. They can only do what they're programmed to do. But we're doing independent things. So it's a weird idea, but just think of it. Matter, energy, and intelligence. But in the world of materialism, there is only matter and energy. You can't explain intelligence. You can't explain, do I have it up here? You can't explain rationality, morals, design, free will, and purpose. We've lost it. So I'm just going to mention this briefly. Theistic evolution. There's some people that say, oh yeah, I believe in evolution, but I believe that God did it. I'm just going to say it bluntly, it's a cop-out. Because the whole purpose of Darwin is to get God out of the equation. So if you just like put him back in at the end, it doesn't prove anything. And it doesn't help anything. An example would be Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH, theistic evolutionist, continued all the stem cell research. He has a divided life. Here in the lab, I'm a scientist, I'm a materialist. Over here in church, I worship the Lord. It just doesn't work, and it doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't solve the problem. You might as well just be a straight materialist. Young Earth versus old Earth. I don't want this to be a barrier. Both views have been looked at by reliable theologians, and it's an argument. But let's not let that argument distract us from the real question. Is there a God or is there no God? As to whether he did it quickly or over a long period of time, that's a theological argument. Let the theologians hash it out. Wherever you feel comfortable. I'll just be blunt, I'm a long Earth guy. So now we're going to look at how does evolution influence medicine. And this is the part of a talk I don't think I've ever heard anybody give before. And I have a unique perspective being 36 years in medical practice. So I'm going to share that with you and see where this goes. I'll try to keep going fast. So we're going to divide medicine into three areas. Acute care, like emergency room medicine, chronic care, think of medications, and we got preventative care. Think of mostly vaccines. And I'm going to say the preventative care is where we hit a disagreement or a potential disagreement. Because if I look at you as a created body, you're working fine. Everything's great. You're a fine-tuned sports car that has everything aligned and you can go, 120 miles an hour. Am I going to look under the hood and start monkeying around there? And your body is so much complex, more complex than any machine. So we just have to, I would say, treat vaccinations with caution because we're tinkering with a body that's already working. And we're putting stuff in there, aluminum, polysorbate 80, aborted cells, different PEG, different compounds, and we're injecting it into the bloodstream. We should do that cautiously. But I don't see that in the vaccination program. 1989 was the first time we started vaccinating newborn babies. I still remember doctors being confused, like the CDC told us to vaccinate newborn babies? Well, they always told us not to do that. Oh, they changed their mind. And then in the 2000s, I think it was, they started saying, you know what, I think we should be vaccinating pregnant moms. And I remember we were told never to vaccinate pregnant. Oh, we changed our mind. So I've been on the path here, the road, watching things change. And you saw it as well, didn't you? Masks, yes, no. Vaccines, yes, no. They're working, they're not working. This flip-flopping. But I'm just going to say preventive care from a creationist standpoint has to be undertaken cautiously, not with wild abandon. And here's another thing I want you to look at, the history of disease. These are various infectious diseases running from the 1850s to the 1950s. You'll notice they're all going down in death rate. So we've got measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria. Vaccines are entering where these last three arrows are. And you can see the curves continue down, but it's not clear that those points where the arrows come in made any difference. Here is diphtheria. When they introduce the vaccine, the curve is already going down. The curve temporarily goes up and then continues downward. Here's, what is this? Pertussis, whooping cough. So again, we introduce the vaccine, it's already going down. And here, again, death rate for measles, already going down, and we introduce the vaccine. So if we give them what they say, vaccines save millions of lives, I have a question. What saved billions of lives? Because if you guys saved millions of lives at those arrow points, that means we saved billions of lives doing what? What was that thing? The epidemiologists have looked at it. This is what they conclude. Industrial revolution, increased food supply, clean water. That's what saves lives. If we want to help third world countries, we should send them food and clean water before anything else. Again, this is scarlet fever, and scarlet fever does not have a vaccine, and we can see the same thing happened. So here's an example of wild abandon. Paul Offit, in this 2002 article, he was trying to, this was not meant for really public consumption, although the public has gotten hold of it, and I think he regrets saying what he said, but it was written to help doctors feel comfortable. We had recently added 5 new vaccines, actually 6 new vaccines to the schedule, and his claim was we could safely give 10,000 vaccines at any one visit based on his understanding of the immune system. Now, he sort of backpedaled on that and said, well, I realize there's a lot of aluminum, but I'm just saying if we took all the aluminum out and it was just purely the proteins that were being injected. I still believe that the statement deserves to be retracted. Here's an example of excellent research. And the author is sitting right in front of us here. And I'm deeply in debt to Brian Hooker for his work that he carries out very courageously. It's Neil Miller and Brian Hooker doing a study that looked at the effect of vaccinated versus non-vaccinated, seeing some chronic illness creeping up in the vaccinated population. But what I note is these studies aren't being done. So I went to, and here's another horrible thing that happens. This is written by Tanya Foster. She has an organization called, what's it called? A Voice for Truth. I don't think I included that in bibliography. You should remember it, A Voice for Truth, where she details that actually hundreds of babies have been aborted as part of medical research. And it's not just the 2 cell lines they're using. They do research, and it continues to this day. It sounds like Nazi medicine. Here's why it sounds like Nazi medicine. The baby has to be extracted intact and alive, has to be dissected within 5 minutes of delivery. And you get lung tissue and this. Let's recap. Points to remember. Atheism is not neutral. It is one of 2 different roads. I think that's probably the most important point I'd like you to remember. We live in a society where we are not allowed to mention God because, oh, well, God doesn't belong there. Well, we see what happens when we take God out of the picture. The theory of evolution functions as a creation meta-narrative that thoroughly grounds science in an atheistic, materialist worldview. All that means is when your kids go to school and learn about the theory of evolution, that's being replaced Genesis. And it's a religious ideology. All the recent scientific discoveries, Big Bang, fine-tuning, DNA, point to theistic, point to a God. You can read that sentence. The key point there is seeing man in the image of God. If we take off that one idea, man in the image of God, It is only a matter of time till we're in Auschwitz. And didn't that sound just slightly like Auschwitz? If we don't acknowledge God, we will be ruled by totalitarian government authority in his place. That's what's been happening. Here we are. So just remember, theism, so the main argument is, oh, well, if you let God back in, we'll lose science. We won't be able to study things because you're always just saying, oh, God did it, God did it. Well, guess what? Science began out of a theistic worldview, and it's sustained by a theistic worldview. And when you take God out of it, you know what happens? You not only get bad things like this, you lose science. That's why Dr. Hooker can't get that study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, because the scientific bodies carefully control what you can study, what you can't study, because they don't want anything that goes against the narrative. So I want people to understand, especially I want to reach out to people that are people of faith, people of a Judeo-Christian worldview. Do not think that you have to kowtow to science. Science is an idol right now. It's that we're being asked to bow to. And I want you to realize the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And if somebody is giving you a mandate and they start with atheistic materialism, I don't generally trust what they're saying. And I think we have permission to question them, even though they may not think we have permission. But it's time for God's people. We're the only thing standing in the way right now. I think the United States is the only reason the world didn't shift into a total totalitarian worldview. And so I just ask all of us to think in these terms. Think of the worldview. Are we in materialism or are we in theism? And realize there's no neutrality. There's only two paths. So let's ask our questions. Does science make faith obsolete? Oh, I give away the answer. Science is practiced by faith in one of two worldviews. Either one has faith. One road begets and sustains science, the other destroys it. Is there a war between science and religion? Not exactly. There's a war between science practice in a theistic worldview and science practice in a naturalistic worldview. There is a war between worldviews of theism and atheism. And action points. So we have to acknowledge the failures of Darwinism. We have to boycott any medical products which use aborted baby cells. We need to repeal the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. If vaccines are safe and effective, why can't drug companies be sued? We must restructure the current organization of vaccine manufacturers. Right now, it's a monopoly. They manufacture, they test, they oversight. Everything's done under one umbrella, and it leads to intense corruption. We must conduct valid scientific studies that look at controlled populations of vaccinated and non-vaccinated. We must remove our children from any educational system that teaches Darwinism as the sole creation meta-narrative. We must remove the pharmaceutical cartel from our internet, television, radio, and print advertising outlets. That's a big change. When I was growing up, we didn't have it. And it's gotten really bad because that's all we hear when we turn on the radio. And if you're not following their dictates, your program is pulled. So here's a pop quiz. Let's see if you're good at it. On which worldview was our country founded, theistic or materialistic? Okay, here's your proof. The laws of nature and nature's God, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. What happens when a theistic worldview meets a materialistic science? We saw what happened. The science is given precedence. No free speech, no freedom of assembly, no freedom of religion. And that's why we have to push back against the science. It has to be changed because it's the science that's creating the problem. We need to go back to Constitution, yes, but we need to do something with our science because our science is destroying us. Some parting thoughts. Deuteronomy 30:19, I set before you life and death. Choose life. Enter through the narrow gate. Wide is the way and broad is the road that enters into destruction. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And this is from my mentor. It's not written down anywhere, but he said this to me in a personal conversation. Don't think you're smart enough to overcome the brainwashing. I was thinking about doing a certain amount of training, and I said, yeah, Mayor, don't worry, I know what's out there. Don't think you're smart enough to overcome the brainwashing. Here are my resources, some of them anyway. My wife will tell you I have way too many books. If you want to take a picture, you're welcome to. There's 3 pages of resources. I would especially commend to you Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Confessions of a Medical Heretic, Robert S. Mendelsohn. That's what really changed my life, other than the first reference, which is the Holy Bible. Gospel of John and Psalms are good places to start. And another book that I really found fascinating is Told Truth by Nancy Pearcey. I'm sorry, are those up long enough for you? Yeah, I got one more. And these are some of my PC, some of the things that I referenced in the presentation there. Some of my favorite websites, Children's Health Defense, Brian Hooker is chief science officer, right? Almost sounds like Mr. Spock to me. Is that, yep, I knew it. Just watch the ears. All right. The Discovery Institute is intelligent design, and then the Highwire. By the way, I think everybody should watch Plandemic 3 coming out on the Highwire sometime in the next few weeks. Keep tuned on Thursdays. All right, I very much appreciate your kind attention. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.